I'm going to be introducing you to using Emmet specifically for HTML because programmers are lazy. And I'll explain what that means a bit later down the line, but it's not that anybody that does computer science refuses to do their coursework. Next term, you're going to be dealing with a web development module, CS139. What I have here is a list of what CS139 will probably teach you. I say probably because I'm not the module organizer. What you probably won't learn, frameworks and libraries, backend servers, how to actually host a website, and tools to assist with design and building. What I would say is that 139 teaches you the concepts of web design, whereas probably don't learn as much the practicalities, what you might encounter if you were to do this as a job. And Emmet is a tool to assist design and building. So this is something that you'll probably not encounter throughout your CS degree if you're anything like me, and then encounter it in the workplace and go, how have I not learned this sooner? To start with, we'll cover a bit about what is HTML. It's short for Hypertext Markup Language. It's gone through various versions, but the current standard is HTML5 and has been for quite a long time in internet talk. A lot of websites are using HTML5 at this point. Pretty much any modern site will do it. HTML defines the content of a page, what is going to appear. And the way that it does this is it uses tags to box content. The first thing you need to encounter is the bit that every HTML file will have. So this is the bare minimum. It's not all completely necessary, but I wouldn't recommend like adding or removing stuff unless you know what you're actually doing. So the first line where it says doc type HTML, that just tells the document that it is in HTML5. In the head tags, this is where the information about the HTML file is stored. This tells a browser how to read it. The title tag is what you would see in the tab at the top. And then everything else that appears on the web page will be slapped in between the body tags. Here's a basic example of some HTML. In the body tags, we have an H1 that has hello world inside it. A div has a p tag inside it, some lorem ipsum text, and that's it. What I want you to know is that the types of tags aren't really important for this. You don't have to understand what each tag does to understand how to use Emmet. When you go into 139 or when you design your own web page, however you want to learn it, you'll be able to use Emmet from the get-go. So this is an example of what it might look like. The boxes wouldn't actually be bordered, but this helps you see what each tag is actually boxing. Some important terms. This p tag is considered a child of the div tag, and the div tag is considered a child of the body tag, and the body tag is considered a parent of h1 and the div tag. These will be useful for Emmet. So this is another tag. You can see that the name is at the front. So the name for this one is input, and then it has a bunch of things called attributes. These are defined with a name, an equals, and then a value. Class and ID are special attributes in HTML. They are easily the most commonly used ones. Can be given to any tag in the body. I mean, technically any attribute can be given to tags, but if it's not relevant, then it won't actually change anything. Class and ID are always relevant. And because they are special, they have what's called their own CSS selectors. Moving on to Emmet. The thing about HTML and writing it out is that it's boring, it's slow, it takes a long time, it's repetitive, it's dull, long-winded, and quite frankly, takes the piss. Programmers are typically what we'd call lazy. We don't like to write things out in full and have things slow, especially if it's doing the same thing over and over again. The way that Emmet works is it lets us write HTML in a lazy way. It also has features for writing other markup languages, but we won't be covering those in this talk, but know that it does have some additional language support. The way that it lets us write HTML is it uses what's called nesting operators, and they are largely based on the CSS selectors to simplify structure. And then once the Emmet is written out, it will be expanded to valid HTML or, again, other languages. It has implementations for most editors. There's a full list on the documentation site. In the examples for this, I'll be doing it on VS Code. Most of the implementations are similar, but there may be some stylistic differences. Emmet.io has the full list of supported editors and how to get Emmet on them, as well as documentation on how to use it. I'm going to show some Emmet in action, and I'm going to do this live. There's not a complicated thing. Let's start with the bit that every file has. Now, if you can remember half what was shown there, I'd be impressed. Fortunately, there isn't too much that you actually need to remember using this. Start by typing an exclamation mark, and in Visual Studio Code, it'll immediately give you a prompt for Emmet abbreviations. If you press Tab here, it will fill it all in for you, and it will also highlight certain bits. If you press Tab, you'll be able to jump between the bits that's highlighted. These are things that you're likely to want to change. For example, you might want to have a proper title for your document. We call it example. And then that's the bit that every HTML file has done in a couple of seconds. So now we'll move on to defining child elements. The symbol for doing that is a greater than sign pointing to the right. We can define something as being a child of the preceding tag like this, and press Tab to complete, and you'll see that we've now immediately translated that straight into HTML. That's good, but it does have the downside of only defining the tags. If we want to have some text in there, what we might want to do is throw in a text block. These are done in curly braces. We expand that, and we can see that text is added in between the tag that it's specified as. If you're needing content, but you don't know what the content is yet, we can also do a lorem, spelling, and then give a number, and it will fill it with that many words of generic lorem text. So that's a useful thing if you're trying to figure out how the content's fitting, but you don't know necessarily what the content is at this point. Moving on, let's consider adding not a child element, but one that appears alongside what we would call a sibling element. This is done with a plus sign, and here we can see if we expand that, the p tag is also a child of the div tag, but not a child of the h1 tag. Suppose that we want to move up in the hierarchy. We can use this caret to move up to a higher tag. So there we can see that we've got a second div that's outside of the first div. And then if we wanted to go up further, the double caret will move it up again. So you can move up as many levels as you need. But sometimes you'll need to have multiple of something. A good example of this is a list. A list will have multiple items, otherwise it would be a terrible list. And it has a multiplier that will replicate it that many times. Now, there is an issue. Say I want to add some text. You'll notice that this text has all been contained within a single list element and has also put it in divs. And that's partly because of how VS Code implements the lorem. But this isn't very useful if you're trying to do multiple list items. So what we need to do is we need to group them. And we can do that just by surrounding what we want to group in parentheses. And now we expand that, and we can see that now we have 3 list items with their respective text. And if we want to have multiple lists, that's doable as well. So yeah, you use grouping to almost always, I think, specify exactly what you want multiplying. Moving on from that, we can also have a form of numbering in our list. So let's say that instead of having lorem text, we want to say list item. We can use a $sign to specify that we want it to be numbered based on the multiplicand. Expanded, we can see that it has 3. And now, as a bit of a bonus or a bit of a challenge, if I were to add some more $signs, can you guess what this might translate to? But yes, it will add placeholder values. So we can also specify a starting point. So if I say at 10, it will start counting from 10 forward. And if I am to put a negative instead, it will count down to 10. So that's numbering. Next, we'll move on to adding IDs and classes. So let's say that we have a button and we want to give it an ID. We can do that by using the hashtag. When that's expanded, you can see that it immediately gives a OK button ID tag. For classes, we just use a period. So we might want to give it, for example, button small and then OK. These are meaningless because there isn't any definition for these classes, but we can see that we can add multiple classes as well. We should note that it's very important, insanely good practice, or rather insanely bad practice, to have multiple IDs for a single element and for different elements to share IDs. But that's fine for classes. And any tag can have any number of classes, and ideally classes would be shared across tags as necessary for the sake of reusability. So finally, we can have a look at other attributes. When we're defining other attributes, we can just surround those in square braces and give them the name and value. So that is a sort of run through of elements of Emmet that I'm going to cover for HTML. The slides have also got these examples on, so we can see how they work. So from this, if you have an inclination for HTML, you might be aware, or you might consider it being possible to write an entire HTML page in a single abbreviation and then expand it. And this is technically true, but it's a terrible, terrible idea. So terrible, I felt the need to underline how bad of an idea it is. When you're writing Emmet, it's going to be a lot harder to spot an error past a certain point. You're not going to realize that you've misspelt something or whether something should be a child or something else. You'll find it incredibly hard. And when you expand it, maybe it won't even all expand. Maybe some of it will be left behind, or it'll be formatted in a way that you don't understand. Don't try and write everything in one. The more detail that you add to an element, the less repeatable those elements are. But Emmet works best in smaller snippets that define structure and then have the detail filled in at a later point. This is an example. Let's say that we have a input for login, and we want to have a name, we want to have a password, we want to have an email, we want to have an email confirmation. We can see that the abbreviation in Emmet doesn't really seem like that much of an abbreviation, because you've got to label each of them, you've got to give the input, and you're going through each of them, giving them a specific class or giving them a specific ID, specifying the attributes for each of the elements. This isn't that much different to writing HTML. A better way of going about it is removing all of the detail, leave the attribute field blank and the class field blank, and now you've got a repeatable statement, and then you can tab through and put in the details. It's a lot easier to read, it's easier to spot when things go wrong, and it's a lot faster as a result. So that's basically everything that I wanted to cover on Emmet. My final test, as it were, is to have a guess at what this monstrosity might achieve.